Hey guys, Nick here with What Game Now, and today I've got a little bit of a different video. This isn't so much talking about specific games, but more just some general observations and something you might want to be aware of, especially if you're into miniature gaming. I apologize for the footage in the background. It's really all I had for you guys to look at, so my apologies. So what we're going to talk about today is the divide that exists in miniature gaming between casual and competitive players. And what happens if you're not familiar with this? You can go on various Facebook groups, talk to people in person, and oftentimes there will be disagreements between people who identify themselves as casual and who identify themselves as competitive. This can lead to arguments, people dropping games, or just stop, or they quit playing a game. To, well, we played the game to the end, but you ruined it because of how you play the game, and just general hard feelings all around. And what I want to talk about is, why does this happen? How can we avoid it, and just in general things to be aware of in the future. Now, I do want to point out before we get going, none of the definitions I'm about to talk about are concrete, and there's going to be some variance from person to person. Neither side is right or wrong. There's nothing wrong with being a casual player. There's nothing wrong with being a casual player, and the same thing's true for a competitive player. Ultimately, it all comes down to what you find to be fun. Now, I am going to point out some behavior that I consider to be unhealthy or toxic, if you prefer to call it that. And that's things that I would recommend avoiding, or just people that there's other problems going on. Finally, where I'm coming from with my information. I have been in miniature gaming for 17 years at this point, and the discussion here is mostly focused around my experience either in person, online, or from people that I trust and consider credible sources. So let's go ahead and get started with some definitions. First off, what exactly do we mean by a competitive or casual player? Let's start with competitive. So a competitive player, in my experience, is somebody who usually focuses on the game itself, specifically in the area of expanding and refining their own skills. They want to play a game, they want to become better at it, they want to compete against really good people. These are the players you often see attending tournaments, and whenever you talk to them about the game, they tend to focus on things like game mechanics and commentary as opposed to model quality or fiction or narrative. Now, there are some dark places competitive players can go. There's two specific subgroups that I want to call out as being rather unpleasant. I'm going to talk about who they are first, and I think this is important because this is one of the sources of friction between the two sides. The first one is what is called a win at all costs, WAAC, or WAC player. These are players who are focused solely on the winning aspect to the expense of everything and everyone else. They want to get a win, they want to feel good about winning, and that's all they care about. Now, unfortunately, that comes at the expense of other players. They tend to push the limits, they tend to be power gaming for the sake of power gaming, throwing everything they've got at somebody who isn't wanting to do that. And what's interesting is when the roles are reversed, what happens when the win at all cost players on the losing end? My experience is they tend to generally turn into very unpleasant people. I've never really had a good experience or heard of a good experience with a win at all cost player who was losing. And it is worth noting that the win at all cost players want to win and feel like they're going to win. They don't want a closely fought game that could go either way, because it's too close to losing for them. Interesting note with these players, oftentimes they're viewed as tournament players, when in reality they usually don't attend tournaments, or at least ones that include large amounts of people outside their normal game group. An example I can give you this player was not necessarily a win at all cost player, but this behavior could be construed as this. I was at a War Machine tournament in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and there was a group of people coming in from out of town who hadn't played before in tournaments. They had been playing in their friend's garage, and they had this one guy in the group who just consistently beat them time and time again. And he was coming in saying how he was going to win this tournament and take all the prizes, and he was going to show everybody how good he was. 10 minutes into his first game and he'd already lost. This is War Machine, it has instant death conditions. That was his first round. His second round, he played me. He never took a second turn. He ran his army towards me and I killed his warcaster. Game over. We were aware of this attitude, so we were a little bit less than merciful on him. And by the time he was done, he not only had he won no games, he had not come any closer to it, and he stopped attending tournaments. And this style of behavior, if the goal is solely for winning, is not a really good thing. And I do want to point out one key difference here between a competitive player and a win-at-all-cost player, and is that a competitive player tries to win, but is more focused on improving their skills. They are just as content with a hard-fought loss than they are with a hard-fought win. In fact, in many cases, many competitive players have no enjoyment out of a game where they stomp somebody and their opponent had no chance. And the reason why is because there's nothing to learn there. One thing that competitive players do is they tend to analyze the game. What went wrong? Where were things, what decisions did they make and how did they affect the overall game? And this is outside of the game after the fact. The second subgroup that I want to call out is, when taken to the extreme can be a little toxic, is the rules lawyers. And this is a catch-all term often used by casual players to refer to anybody who questions the rules. But it is somebody who uses the rules to their own advantage. And they're going to do it by accusing you of playing wrong, accusing you of cheating, nitpicking every move, wanting to see every rule in every book that you're doing that's to their disadvantage. The important distinction here is when you flip it around and you start questioning them, they get really defensive and angry. They're the people who are holding their opponents to a higher standard than they are themselves. Now, I tend to fall more on the casual perspective, and I do tend to, there's a difference between wanting to play by the rules and using the rules to beat your opponent outside the head with them. And say, look, if you're playing something wrong, I'm going to point out to you. But personally, as a competitive player, the difference here is a rules lawyer would stop there. A good competitive player or a healthy competitive player would expect the same in return. Yes, they may have a high expectation for how you're playing the game on tight measurements and playing all the rules correctly, but a healthy competitive player holds themselves to that same standard. The rules lawyers are the ones who don't, and that's one of the really unfortunate areas that we tend to see. Now, contrasting the competitive player is the casual player. And usually what I've found with casual players is they tend to be very focused and concerned with aspects of the game that aren't actually gameplay. You're going to talk about things like painting, the general social experience, narrative elements, and such. And it's also worth noting that a casual player, in my experience, tends to not think about the game as much as a competitive player. Even though they may play a similar number of games, a casual player who plays 200 games a year, that doesn't make them competitive. Whereas there are competitive players I know who may only play 50 games a year. The thing here, though, is the competitive player is constantly thinking about the game outside of the game, whereas the casual player tends to stop once the game is over. And there's nothing wrong with any of this stuff. Just as we had with competitive players, there are a few examples of some unhealthy extremes I've encountered in casual players. The first one is what I refer to as the rivet counters. These are people who are very focused on narrative accuracy. They want a game to mimic the fiction of the world. And they get very upset when this is not met. A very good example that I had with somebody, excuse me, get a drink of water here. So a good example I had with somebody was I had somebody get on me on the internet and was kind of upset that on one of my Space Marine squads I put the wrong squad symbol on it. Literally going on there and saying, your models have the wrong thing. I wouldn't, and literally told me they would not play against that on the tabletop. And it's like, that's a little extreme, but really? I mean, that's an experience that actually happened to me. Typically, this type of player tends to be limited to historical games where such accuracy is confirmable. A lot of fictional universes tend to be very flexible on their rules or on their conventions like that. But historical games, you have actual history to go off of. I know people who have encountered historical players that will refuse to play games against people whose armies are not painted in the proper color, shade, and decal markings of whatever army they're playing. These are the people who will just kind of sit there and have a small stroke when they encounter say a British army, but it's all pink. And again, this isn't necessarily a problem. It's when they go to the extent of, well, now they're ragging on their opponent because of it. Now they're taking everybody else's game down because they had this expectation. The second major type of group that I've seen in casual players that I tend to find fairly toxic are the people who have very harsh painting requirements. Now, I play fully painted as often as possible. For example, all the heavy gear games we've played, every model's been fully painted by me. I play painted as often as possible. If I'm not playing with something painted, there's usually a very good reason why. But I understand that not everyone has that same level of investment. Not everyone has the same amount of time. I literally watched somebody deny a game to somebody because their models were not painted. The reason this person's models weren't painted is because they were legally blind. They can't paint them, and they didn't have the hundreds of dollars, actually probably thousands because it was a 40K army, to get it professionally painted. Another comment that I've heard from these kind of people that, again, this is the extremes. These are the people who are way on the extreme, who look at their opponent and say, no, you have to do this too. Was somebody literally, there was a discussion on a War Machine group about this where they were discussing, should painting be required? And there was one person who said, if my opponent chooses not to paint their models, so I choose not to play against them, what's the difference? And it's like, really? Another example was somebody was ragging about unpainted models, and their group was apparently very, very conservative when it came to painted models. You had to paint your models. So they played a game with somebody who had unpainted models, and just to spite this person, literally poured a pile of bits for a model on the table and said, well, that's my tank. Arguing that the tank that's unassembled, literally just parts that are clipped off the sprue, is no more playable than a fully assembled, ready-to-go model that's actually been primed at that point. Again, the individual behavior is not the problem, it's when it's taken to the extreme, and I just want to point these out that there are people on both sides of this who go into the extremes. So, where do I think the issue is, and just some general commentary here. Personally, in my experience, I have found that casual players tend to be the most vocal about their displeasure with competitive players. That does not mean that competitive players don't have problems with casual players. I just usually tend, when I see a disagreement like this, it's usually a casual player going off on somebody who is being a little more competitively minded. A very common example will be somebody posts on a Facebook group and says, I'm thinking about buying this model or this model. What do you guys think? And somebody will post this nicely thought out, here's the advantages and disadvantages on the table, and there will literally be, in some cases, the original, the OP, responding to that going, well, no, I don't care about that, I just want the, what looks cool, and how, just losing their mind because of that. And this is the kind of thing that honestly kind of gives gamers a bad name. It's these little freakouts like this. From both sides, here's usually what I tend to encounter. The casual players usually accuse competitive players of being unfun and ruining the game. And that's because to them, the casual players, the game is more than just the actual rules. So when you see a competitive player, when they see a competitive player ranting about poorly balanced models, or this model sucks, or playing a game and trying to win, the casual players will often feel that as being unfun. Well, that's taking the fun or the immersion out of their game. On the other side, competitive players can get very frustrated with casual players in terms of, usually casual players tend to be much looser with the rules. House rules are a thing with casual players. It's very rare with competitive players. The only major house rule that I know for competitive players is the ITC format, or indeed any tournament format for Games Workshop games. But you'll see competitive players really get upset when casual players essentially disregard the rules. They're very loose with their measurements. Maybe they're playing a rule that the casual player is playing a rule they think the way it's supposed to be played when that's not actually what the rule says. Good example here was, so let me give you a good example of this casual versus competitive divide and where you can see both sides coming onto this. The Sisters of Battle for Warhammer 40,000 came out and have a mechanic called Miracle Dice. And the way that it works is anytime you make a dice roll, you can replace one or more of the dice in the dice roll with a pool of dice that you acquire throughout the game. Basically means if you need a 6, you can guarantee a 6 if you have it available. But it wasn't poorly worded. It was worded properly, but there was a divide in the community about how that worked in relation to a unit firing multiple weapons or multiple shots. Exactly as written, it was you could only replace one dice when you were shooting because each die roll was considered separate, and you could only do this miracle dice mechanic once per phase. And you got this casual versus, or some people turn into a casual versus competitive dynamic. The competitive players were getting very angry with this discussion because if you literally read the rules, there wasn't a question, there wasn't a debate. And let me clarify what the debate was. The debate was, say I have a unit of 10 models that shoots 2 shots each. So it's going to make a total of 20 shots when it attacks. From the game's perspective, how many attacks are you making? In 40K, you're actually making 20 attacks. You're just rolling them all simultaneously. The discussion was, if you're rolling those 20 attacks, could you replace all 20 of them with this miracle dice, or were you only limited to one? A lot of the competitive players who were being accused of being win-at-all-cost players who wanted to keep sisters down, or rules lawyers because, well, you're arguing a rule and ruining everybody else's fun, were saying, no, that's not at all how that works. Just read the rules and there's not a debate. On the other side, the casual players were going through and essentially not reading the rules. They were not looking at this and reading the rules. They were essentially glossed over it and went with that. This is a really good example of that dynamic. The competitive players are looking at the casual players going, what are you doing? You are literally making up your own rules that don't exist. The casual players think that the competitive players are trying to torpedo this entire mechanic because, well, why wouldn't it work that way? Games Workshop came down and the competitive players were right. But it was almost like, it was a very, very livid discussion between the two sides on that front. And it came down, in a lot of cases, to casual versus competitive on how you interpreted it. I do want to point out, again, that neither is necessarily right. Everyone is playing the game for their own reasons, whether you're a casual player or competitive player. There's nothing wrong with that. This video is focused on the friction that occurs. Now, why does that friction occur? Personally, I think it's when the groups come into contact with each other and don't come in with proper expectations. People are going to have different opinions. That's okay. But you need to understand those different opinions and where they're coming from. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong if there's an actual debate. Sometimes you can be factually, if you're factually wrong, you're factually wrong. There's no change there. But you'll get this discussion going back and forth where the groups had expectations or have their own expectations and are trying to imprint that on everyone else. A lot of the friction in my experience comes in the fact when the competitive players try to play a competitive game against a casual player, or a casual player tries to play a casual game against a competitive player. If you think about those extreme cases I was talking about, and this isn't just extremes, but just even a little bit along that scale, if they come into contact with somebody who doesn't agree with them, it is going to be a bad situation for everyone involved. And I think that's the source of this friction. I usually see a lot of this stuff happening when you get people not having proper expectations about the discussion or line of or game that they're about to have. You'll see a post on a Facebook group that says, I'm looking to get between these two models, and if the original poster doesn't specify, well, are they talking mechanically or visually or ease of assembly or something like that, you'll get people providing every single response. And then that leaves room for people to argue, well, that's not what they wanted. Or in some cases, I've even had the original poster come back and get on people. One that I remember that happened to me was this person posted, do you put, the Space Marines in 40K have this unit called the Aggressors, and the Aggressors can either have essentially a machine gun on their hands or flamers. And the debate was, and somebody posted, well, which do you prefer, the flamers or the machine guns? And I'm like, well, I prefer the machine guns because, quite frankly, the flamers suck. I went through this description. It didn't quite say that, but that's what it amounted to. Basically, the flamers sucked at the time, and the machine guns are just all around better. And the original poster went off on me for like, well, I don't care about that. All I care about is look. How am I supposed to know that just by reading a post where you never referenced that? It's a difference in expectation. Now, I went in not knowing what they wanted. Okay, I'll accept that. But at the same time, they're coming back at me because I had a different opinion than them. This is, I think, where the friction tends to occur. And I think that, like I said, I think the biggest issue is not having clear expectations for the interaction. So my advice, if you're worried about this issue, if you're worried about, oh, I don't want competitive players to come ruin my casual experience, or if you're somebody who is competitive and you want to maintain a competitive level of gaming, my advice for how to avoid this is have a discussion. Have a minute-long, 30-second discussion about what kind of game or what kind of feedback or what kind of commentary you're expecting. Go on there. If you say you're this original person who got on me for this aggressor issue, say, hey, which one do you pick? Which one do you like the look of? Okay, if you just say which one do you prefer, that's vague and open to interpretation. Now, there's a debate of people assuming the interpretation, and then also at the same time, don't go off on somebody if they get the interpretation wrong or have a different interpretation than you. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, but what I'm trying to get at is try and avoid miscommunications. If you want gameplay feedback, ask for gameplay feedback. If you want a casual game, say to your opponent, hey, I'm looking for a more casual game. I often find that 99% of problems that's going to diffuse. It's not necessarily going to stop everything, especially when you start dealing with the extremes I mentioned before. It doesn't necessarily prevent that, but it's a good way to start. So have that discussion, and then if something comes up where there is a disagreement, don't overreact. Please don't overreact. Please don't start yelling at people or yelling through the internet. It's not helping. Some people are just trying to help you. Okay? They're trying to help you. Yes, they made an assumption. Yes, it was wrong, but you're also in the wrong for going off on them for that because you didn't provide them any information about that. Okay? So it's a miscommunication. Life goes on, and just don't. When it comes to gaming, like I said, have that discussion with your opponent and say, look, do you want a casual game? Do you want a competitive game? If you know in advance, it's a lot of information. And when you have that conversation, you will very quickly come to know the people where you can expect the casual or competitive games. Yeah, you might have to go through a game to realize that maybe their definition of casual is a little bit too competitive for you. Don't throw a temper tantrum in that case. Log it as information, say, okay. When you go around to ask a game again, keep that in mind. So, a few closing comments here, and these are things that I've just general comments. First off, it's your fun versus their fun. Nobody's right and nobody's wrong, okay? It's entirely your own opinion and what you find fun. This is like arguing which company's models look better. Given that it's personal taste, you can't really have that discussion. Next off, if a mistake is made, don't blow up or go overboard in response. Okay? Nobody's trying to maliciously attack you, usually. Don't go back at them. And then finally, this is something as a competitive player that I've seen a fair bit thrown around. Very large tournaments are not full of the toxic win-at-all-cost rules lawyers. Most of those people tend to stay away from those events because their tricks don't work there. If you're a win-at-all-cost player and you go to a big tournament, I promise you, you're not the best person there. Unless you have a bit of a ego complex. But even then, that usually lasts for one tournament. They'll drop after a couple rounds and everybody's life will go on. Conversely, a lot of the rules lawyers who try to pull over their opponent and try and beat them down with the rules, you're playing against competitive players, good sir. You're probably encountering somebody who's playing clean and is going to tear you apart for not playing clean. And if there's a discussion, they're going to call the judge, and if the judge gets annoyed at you, you will be kicked out of the event. So those rules lawyers really get disincentivized from these larger tournaments. Usually if there's a rules discussion in a larger tournament, it's an actively gray area, and it might have been really important at the time. But on the whole, tournaments are actually the most casual, relaxed games I've ever had. That's because everybody knows going in what to expect. You know for a fact your opponent is not going to pull any punches. You know for a fact your opponent is going to have a reasonable level of competence with the rules. Now, yes, new players go to tournaments. Yes, inexperienced people go to tournaments. That's all fine. This is just an on-average thing. So a lot of the extreme behaviors I mentioned above tend to avoid these larger events. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for going to tournaments and traveling to tournaments. Yes, if you go travel to a local store and one of their buddies is the judge who rules against you on everything even though you're right, that's not a tournament problem. That's a community problem at that location. That's a bad tournament, not that all tournaments are bad. So I hope this made some sense. I hope you haven't minded watching me open Force of Will cards, Ghost in the Shell set. But that's just me. Obviously, I'm curious to know what anybody else thinks. Like I said, this is a gray area. There's a lot of discussion here. I see a lot of people go off on this, and it's more than just that. I encounter it with people playing different versions of different rules. Somebody will be maybe playing an older edition of a rule set and think it's better than everything else. So when somebody provides commentary relating to a newer rule set, you get this distinction here. And that's part of where I've built this. I've actually encountered that a fair bit in some other communities where older editions get played still, and when people start talking, they don't clarify what edition they're talking about and can get upset when somebody suggests an edition that they don't like. And that's kind of where I'm modeling this idea of lack of expectation, or not establishing expectation off of. So with that, guys, have a good one.
Hey, this is Dave. If you like what we're doing here at What Game Now, go ahead and click on one of the videos which should be on either side of me, or click right in the middle and go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell once you subscribe so that you know when we have new videos. Please go ahead and share us with your friends. Let everybody know that we're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for all of our subscribers already. And we look forward to bringing you more content every chance that we get.